Now let's go ahead and practice inserting a pivot table in Excel. And luckily Excel makes it incredibly easy to do so. In the Insert menu, you have two options. You can select Pivot Table to create a blank pivot, where you determine what data you're analyzing and where the pivot table will live, or you can use the Recommended Pivot Table options, which will allow you to browse some pre-populated starting points. Now, if I'm being honest, I don't find the recommendations very helpful. Personally, I prefer to just build my pivot tables from scratch, but it's important to know that those recommendations do exist if you choose to use them. So let's jump into Excel and actually practice this. Alright, so here I am in Excel. I've opened up the IMDb movie database file available in the course resources, and there are a few different ways that I can insert a pivot from here. Excel is actually really smart and helpful when it comes to inserting pivots. So the simplest way to do this is to simply select any cell from within the source data that you care about, go into the Insert menu, and press Pivot Table. And as you can see, even though I only selected one cell, it's identified a range from A1 through R3726. If I scroll to the right, you'll see that it's identified R as the last column and row 3726 as the last row. So even though I had only manually selected one cell, Excel was able to identify the outer bounds of this data range and populate the reference accordingly. Now the second part of this prompt says, okay, where do you want this pivot table to be placed? By default, it will typically show New Worksheet, which is what I prefer. Otherwise, if you have an existing worksheet that you'd like to add the pivot table to, you can do that as well. In this case, let's choose New Worksheet and press OK. And there you go. We've got a new worksheet created, a blank pivot table template here, and then we have our field list off to the right, which we're going to dive into in the next lecture. So that's the simplest way to insert a pivot table. Keep in mind that some other options are to select the specific data range first. So if I only selected, let's say A1 through P26, and then I chose Insert Pivot Table. Since I had selected a specific range, Excel in this case says, okay, he doesn't care about any of the columns after P or after row 26. We'll use this reference for the pivot, and you could press OK there. A third approach, which is a bit more manual, would be to insert a new tab first, then choose Insert Pivot Table, and then navigate to the actual IMDb movie database and select your data from there. So a few different ways to do it. I'd recommend the first approach that we took. I'll just delete this sheet because it really is the simplest way to get started. So there you go. We have our blank pivot. In the next lecture, we'll talk about actually creating and manipulating some views.